There were policemen at the scene, and no policeman officially showed up until 1:22, which is 13 minutes after Tippit was shot. So there was supposed to be only one policeman there, but she saw policemen. So I think that other policemen were involved in killing Tippit.
Hello, police operator. What is shooting out here? Where is it at? Between Marsalis and Berkeley. It's a police officer. Somebody shot him. What's it? 404 10th Street. 78. It's in a police car. Number 10. Number 10.
Your investigation of J.D. Tippit and who was he? And
Lavelle told me that Captain Will Fritz, who is the head of homicide, said, make sure you can wrap up a good case on Oswald for shooting Tippit because we're not too sure about this Kennedy business. Get right down into it. They didn't have much evidence to go on for Oswald shooting Kennedy, and so they latched onto the Tippit case, but the story doesn't hold up at all. That's one reason I zeroed in on this aspect of the case, kind of zoom in on East 10th Street, and I spend hundreds of pages on what happened in this short period of time on one street in Dallas. Gee, here's this big Warren report and hardly mentions Tippit, and yet it's an important part of their propaganda case against Oswald, and why didn't they investigate it? And then you get into it and you find out the Dallas police didn't really bother investigating this very much, which, if anything, is an insult to the memory of their slain brother officer, that normally they would try to, you would think, try to get the evidence clear. But this shows the corruption of the Dallas Police Department, and they were heavily involved in the assassination and the messing up the Tippit murder on purpose. So I began to think this is the area I should study because I'm always fascinated by the areas that people neglect. So I went out and spent many years, going through documents in the National Archives and in Texas and interviewing everybody I could find in Texas about it. Penn Jones became a mentor of mine, and one of the pieces of advice he gave me, and he also gave it to Larry and probably a lot of other people, was take one aspect of the case, one that hasn't been studied enough, and research the hell out of it. And I thought that was great journalistic advice because no one person can do the whole assassination. Vincent Bugliosi tried to do that in his monstrous book. I wanted to zero in on this neglected incident and see what I could find out. And I found out some quite startling things about Tippit, that he was not the man that they portrayed him as being, and that he had a direct role in the plot. Alan Dulles, one of the Warren commissioners, former CIA director, brought up something surprising. He said to Curry, is there any truth to the rumor that Tippit was involved in narcotics? This came out of the blue, and Curry said, well, I never heard anything about that. The fact that he was, they didn't want to know much about him told me something. A lot of the evidence was a mess. The physical evidence was a mess. The eyewitnesses remarkably contradict each other. And it is normal in a criminal case for eyewitnesses to sometimes contradict each other. But in the Tippit case, it's very stark that you have people who said Oswald did it. Then you have about an equal number who said, no, it was one or two other guys who didn't look like Oswald who did it. And they give very different descriptions. It's almost like, as one of the researchers in Dallas told me, like there are two whole sets of witnesses to this incident. And Jerry Rose, who's a good assassination researcher, had a very interesting theory that I think makes a lot of sense, that the Tippit murder was a staged scene, and Jack Ruby staged it with people he knew. A lot of the witnesses turn out to have connections with Jack Ruby. And so he engineered a bunch of witnesses to that scene who could report the way he wanted them to, and he might have even been there, and he might have even been one of the gunmen. I think 2, 3, or 4 people were involved in killing Officer Tippit, none of whom were Oswald. Some of the Ruby-connected witnesses actually didn't follow the script very clearly, and they gave evidence that contradicted the Warren Commission report.
I'm just thinking about Tippit. What did we know about him?
I mean, I found out some things that weren't generally known about him. For example, he had a lot of war trauma. He was in World War II. He was a small-town guy from East Texas who grew up as a farmer in a very, tough circumstances in the 20s and 30s, and wanted to get out, and he joined the paratroopers, which is a very dangerous, traumatizing kind of form of military action in the Army. And he served in the latter months of World War II in Germany, and then he stayed in Germany for a while with the occupation troops, and he was a light machine gunner. So he knew his way around weapons, as his father also told me. But he suffered trauma in the war, like a lot of men did, and came back. And his father and other people said that JD was very nervous and a little wild for a while. And jumping out of planes was very frightening for him. And that's something I wouldn't do. He came back and suffered what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then it was called psychoneurosis. Tippit came back with a lot of trauma, and one of the effects of that was that he couldn't look people in the eye, and can be a fatal flaw for a police officer and might have contributed to his death. But he was also tested in his police file. You find a Rorschach test that a psychiatrist did on him soon after he became a policeman in the early 50s, and it was a very disturbing test. The psychiatrist said that this man is very disturbed and might lead to some serious errors of judgment. And he said he resorted to edging when looking at the cards. And what that means is when you look at Rorschach cards, you know how they have those shapes on them you're supposed to interpret that gives a sense of your psychological state. He would turn them sideways and look at the edges of the cards, which is very bizarre and unusual behavior. And the psychiatrist thought that was very disturbing. And that's only one report, but it shows that the guy, and I heard this from his mistress and his boss and other policemen, that he was a guy who wouldn't look you in the eye and would sort of shuffle around. And he wasn't very educated, but he was also a security guard for a theater and a drive-in. And some of the young people who he had to kind of watch out for at the drive-in said that he was a fairly rough guy who pushed them around and wasn't very popular with them. And so he had his dark side, you know, and he was a malleable kind of fellow. Perhaps another thing I found out, he was financially overburdened because he owned two homes, which is unusual for somebody making only $494 a month. He had one home and they moved to another one. They rented out the other home. So they were struggling to pay the mortgage. And so he was working these odd jobs, but he may have had some other illicit sources of income. There are rumors, you know, when Dulles mentions drug activity, they portrayed him as a good family man with 3 kids and a nice wife, but he was philandering around, and he had several girlfriends. And I interviewed his mistress, Johnny Maxie Witherspoon, who was an attractive blonde waitress he worked with at Austin's Barbecue in Oak Cliff. And they had an affair, and she gave me a great interview, very candid. She seemed very honest and wanted to get it off her chest. And she said she felt kind of ashamed of the whole thing, but she was very frank about how they had this sexual affair that went on for, she said a few months, but she told the House Select Committee it was for 2 years. And there was even a report that Tippit asked his wife for a divorce the morning of the assassination, but according to Mrs. Witherspoon, actually that Mrs. Tippit was thinking of getting a divorce. So there was a lot more to this man than this sort of simple cop that he was portrayed as being. But he had been on the force for 11 years and never been promoted. And I was told that was partly because he had this bad habit of not looking people in the eye, and partly because he wasn't very well educated and couldn't pass the written tests. So he was a mediocre officer at best. He'd been involved in one fatal shooting. Another one of the stories that one encounters is his mistress, Johnny Maxie Witherspoon's husband, was pursuing them around Oak Cliff for a while. He was very jealous. And some people claim that Tippit was shot by her husband. And I investigated that quite thoroughly, and I believe I disproved that. I think that's a red herring, but that's another piece of interesting information. But I don't think the husband killed Tippit. He was en route to work at the time, and I think Tippit was killed for another reason. He was killed by 2 or 3 or 4 men, and I think it related to the assassination. I go into my theories about who these men might be. One of the things that Alan Dulles said sarcastically at a public appearance was, if you people think Oswald didn't do these things, give us other suspects. So I thought, okay, well, it's incumbent upon us to name some other possible suspects. And I think that 1 or 2 policemen were involved in killing Tippit. And Jack Ruby might have been there. He might have been involved. And there was a hoodlum named Darrell Wayne Garner who was associated with Ruby. And he made some very self-incriminating statements that seemed to possibly link him with the assassination or with the murder of Tippit. And he apparently shot Warren Reynolds, who was a Tippit witness, who was a block away and saw the man. There were probably two men running away, and he saw one of them, and he wouldn't identify him as Oswald. And then he got shot in the head. And then he conveniently changed his story after miraculously surviving this gunshot. And the police thought that Daryl Garner had shot Reynolds, probably at the request of Jack Ruby. And there were a couple of very, very suspicious policemen running around Oak Cliff at the time. One was Harry Olson, was really seemed up to his neck in the assassination. He was, for example, the night of the assassination, he sat in a car with Jack Ruby and Olson's girlfriend, who was a Ruby stripper. And they both worked Ruby into a frenzy and basically said that Oswald should be killed and drawn and quartered. And, this went on for 2 or 3 hours. And what I think this was the underworld giving the order to Ruby that you have to kill Oswald, which made Ruby very agitated because it's, a very dangerous thing that he did, but he had no choice. And so here's Harry Olson involved in that. And he was in Oak Cliff at the time. He claimed he was guarding an estate, which was misleading because Oak Cliff was kind of a shabby middle-class neighborhood. They didn't have estates. And then he changed the story to say, well, it was the house of somebody who had died, so it was part of his estate. But there was a house in Oak Cliff where they had high-stakes gambling, and another researcher thinks Harry Olson might have been there. But he was very close to the Tippit scene, might have even encountered Tippit while Tippit was running around Oak Cliff trying to find Oswald, which we'll get into in a minute. But I think Olson is a very suspicious character who may well have been one of the people who shot Tippit. And it's interesting, he was fired by Chief Curry in early December of '63 and basically fled to California and then was traced to Las Vegas and hasn't been seen since. But a very suspicious guy.
I'm interested a little bit in the actual shooting now, from what the witnesses said to what the evidence demonstrates. So let's go into that for people who are maybe unaware of exactly what happened and what time it happened.
Yeah, I'll give you the basic. The Warren Commission said that Tippit was cruising slowly down a street on East 10th Street in Oak Cliff, which is a suburb of Dallas. It's across a viaduct from downtown. And happened to see a pedestrian. He pulled over the pedestrian who he started to question. The guy unexpectedly shot him. But there are different versions from witnesses of which direction the guy was walking in, which is important because, for one thing, what rules Oswald out as a shooter was that he was seen at his rooming house in Oak Cliff at 104 by his housekeeper. And it's 9/10 of a mile away from where Tippit was shot. And if Oswald walked that distance, I've walked that distance many times, as have other researchers, and it's about a 15-minute walk. And so he couldn't have gotten there in time to shoot Tippit. Tippit died at probably 109, and that's established by a number of parameters. And some people even say 106, 107, but probably 109. The Warren Commission changed it to approximately 115 to make it just barely possible for Oswald to get there, but he couldn't have done that. The only way Oswald could have been there is if somebody drove him, which is possible, but I have no evidence of that. He was probably already at the movie theater. He was seen by a worker at the theater as going into the Texas Theater not too far away at about 1 o'clock to 1:07. So it wasn't Oswald, so who was it? And what was Tippit doing? And one of my major discoveries, there have been speculation from the beginning, as early as December '63, that Tippit was somehow sent to find Oswald and track him down. But there wasn't really any hard proof of this. But I interviewed Tippit's father, Edgar Lee Tippit, who had never been interviewed before. And he was 90 years old, living in Clarksville, where he'd always lived, and a very vigorous, very sharp old man, still working as a farmer, and his memory seemed very good, and a nice man in some ways, although he had a racist streak, but he seemed honest. He wanted to find out what happened. He's just like everybody else. He didn't totally believe the Warren report, and he wished he had known more about it, and his son had been killed, and he wanted to know why. So he did some sleuthing around on his own. One of the things he did was he went to see Marie Tippit, who was JD's widow, soon after the assassination, and he told me that she told him that very soon after the assassination, Dallas policemen visited her to tell her what had happened to her husband. And this policeman said, J.D. and I were given orders to find Lee Harvey Oswald, who was fleeing, the assassination, and track him down in Oak Cliff. This policeman said, I got involved in an auto accident. I didn't get to the scene of the crime, and J.D. got there and got shot. And Mr. Tippit didn't remember the name of the other officer, but I think it could have been an officer, Menzel, who was actually assigned to that district, who was behaving rather oddly that day, and I track his movements in the book. And there was an auto accident. Nobody's ever looked into this before, but if you go into the police radio records, there was an auto accident 11 blocks from the site of the Tippit shooting at about 1:11, which is right after the Tippit shooting. So that story seems to check out. And so here is confirmation from some good sources that Tippit was told to track down Oswald. And what's fascinating about that is the Dallas police, according to the official version, didn't know who Lee Harvey Oswald was until he was arrested at the Texas Theater, which happened about 1:49 p.m., which was 40 minutes after Tippit was shot. It was 1:46 that they said a suspect is hiding in the balcony of the Texas Theater, and police just swarmed in. And there were even Secret Service men there who were not officially accounted for, and FBI agents, and, the whole schmear. I interviewed Detective Lavelle, and I said when I was listening to the police radio, I noticed when Kennedy was shot, they seemed very calm, reporting on this, and officers asking questions. You could say they were being professional, but it almost seemed rather cold and callous. And then yet when they say an officer is shot, suddenly everybody gets excited and the pace of all the transmissions gets very agitated and everybody's racing into Oak Cliff. And I asked Lavelle this, and he got a little smile and he said, yeah, it wasn't no different than a South Dallas, and then he used the N-word shooting. And I was kind of shocked by this racist comment. He said, as the old saying goes, he kind of framed it that way, but he was indicating that Kennedy's murder was no big deal. He actually said that. But when an officer gets killed, that's more important to us. I mean, it's certainly natural that when an officer gets killed, the police department really goes all out. But the president had just been murdered, which you would think would be important there too. But a little more than an hour, they get rid of the presidential assassin scapegoat and Tippit. Now, why would they want Tippit killed? And I go into this in the book that it is possible he was one of the gunmen on the grassy knoll. There's some evidence for it and some that might work against it, but I could go into that in a little while. But I think it definitely proves that he was part of a conspiracy involving the Dallas police, because they didn't know who Oswald was until he got to the police station officially when they resolved the question of his identity, because when he was captured, he had a wallet with 2 different identifications in it. So they didn't really know officially until after 2 o'clock. And yet here's Tippit and this other policeman told, and they weren't told by police radio. They must have had other forms of communication, either separate radio or using public telephones, which Tippit was known to use pay phones, which is interesting and odd too. So they were getting directions, and that proves that Tippit was in on this plot. And he may have been assigned, just go kill Oswald or go capture Oswald. That would be a very neat solution to the whole thing, wouldn't it, from the point of view of the authorities, to get rid of this guy real fast.
Or another alternate view that I had is that he was supposed to drive Oswald somewhere.
Right, that's been mentioned by people. There was an airport, there is still an airport that's not too far from there. Also, Jack Ruby's apartment was 2 blocks away from where Tippit was shot. And even Henry Wade, the DA, said he wondered if Oswald was headed toward Ruby's apartment to hole out or to be transferred somewhere. I don't think this is true, because Tippit was going in a direction that was away from the airport. The theory that he was supposed to help Oswald escape doesn't match what I was told, that he was sent to hunt down Oswald. That's a very different thing. So I don't believe that story. I think these are kinds of speculations that came up in the absence of other evidence. But, when I hear a story from a witness such as Mr. Tippit, I don't just automatically believe it. I check it out with all the other evidence that one can find in the FBI reports of interviews with policemen, of which there are a lot, and the Dallas Police Department records and the House Select Committee investigations. They interviewed a lot of policemen and other people, and the police radio transmissions, even though some of those are suspect. You can draw a picture of what was going on in Oak Cliff, and I spent years doing this, trying to figure out what was credible about what was happening. There was a lot of activity there, and there were a number of policemen running around Oak Cliff suspiciously before Oswald was found at the theater. And then there was a second suspect arrested at the theater, too, who was taken out the back way. So it was a very complicated picture to try to make sense of. And I do my best. I don't think after 50 years we can answer all the questions exactly, but we can sort out some of them. You know, one of the things, the Warren report and the House Select Committee relied very heavily on the ballistics evidence to convict Oswald of killing Tippit, because the witness accounts were really pretty terrible. Helen Markham was the star witness for the Warren Commission. She was a waitress who lived nearby and said she saw the whole shooting from catty corner away from the shooting, and the gunman ran past her, and she identified Oswald at a lineup. But as I said, the lineups were tainted, and she kept feigning. She was hysterical at the scene. I got this from Detective Lavelle, and she kept passing out actually at the lineup. And then when she gave, she said, yeah, that's the guy that all the policemen applauded. And then when she gave testimony to the Warren Commission, she appeared not to identify Oswald. It was really farcical. The lawyer grilling her couldn't get her to identify Oswald until he basically put the words in her mouth. And she also said Tippit was shot at 106, which would rule out Oswald as the shooter. So she was not a good witness for the prosecution. So they relied on the ballistics, and it's complicated, but just to make it very simple, they found some cartridges that had been supposedly discarded by the fleeing gunman, and but they were linked to Oswald's gun by an expert witness who said they were fired from Oswald's gun. Well, you've interviewed John Armstrong, who wrote Harvey and Lee. He's proven that you cannot connect Oswald with the rifle or the pistol. There is no actual chain of evidence, so we don't really know what kind of gun Oswald might have had, or even if he had a gun. But the bullets, there were 4 bullets recovered. They could not be matched with the gun. They were too mangled to be matched with the gun. And it was very odd that one of them has a good chain of evidence. It was taken out of Tippit's body at the hospital. But 3 of them were not found until months later. The Warren Commission finally got around to saying, where are the other bullets? And the police had them in a drawer somewhere, which is a terrible chain of evidence. So the ballistics evidence, also there were 2 different makes of ammunition that were found, and that's very odd. The Warren Commission had a hard time explaining that. So if anything, it points to a couple of shooters.
Well, you can't gloss that over. What we're talking about, shells with the ejection marks on the cartridge from an automatic revolver.
That's true. The several policemen at the scene said that an automatic was used, and then they changed that to a revolver. It's very different. And also, Lavelle told me, Detective Lavelle, when he got to the scene, somebody pointed to the cartridges, and there were 4 of them lying very close to each other on the pavement. And that's totally different from the story that the Warren Commission tells you, that they were found by witnesses. A couple different witnesses supposedly found them in the bushes and around, scattered around. But Lavelle said he saw them all neatly ejected, which is the kind of thing an automatic would do. So the ballistics evidence is worthless, really, in the Tippit case. It cannot connect Oswald to the shooting, and exonerates him further and points to 2 people shooting Tippit.
Yeah, I would probably back up from the statement when you say they're worthless. What they do, they exonerate Lee. So when you discover the evidence and you look at that carefully, I understand that one officer actually put in his initials on a shell as well.
Now, that's another interesting story that, well, it's interesting. Some of the reports say policemen are supposed to mark shells when they find them at the scene by scratching their initials inside them, but Lavelle told me that was not the normal procedure in 1963 with the Dallas police, because it's hard to do that. So he said they were supposed to put them in a little envelope and then mark them later in the laboratory. But I got him to admit that these shells were not marked at all. They were the marks that were found on them later were forgeries. And the policemen, 2 policemen said they marked them. Lavelle basically said these people were lying. So that's another problem with the evidence that they were, these shells were planted later in an attempt to frame Oswald, that, they could have gotten a hold of a gun that they said was Oswald's gun and fired 4 shots from it and collected the cartridges and claimed that he fired them. That's just very easy to do. And that really doesn't prove anything. And, and then even Tippit's gun was taken away from the scene. There was a witness who was kind of out of control, former Marine named Ted Calloway, who took Tippit's gun, which he fell on top of when he got shot, and commandeered a cab and went off in search of the killer and took the gun. And when he came back to the scene, there were a bunch of men who were in a station wagon. They were going deer hunting, and they had rifles. A couple of them were policemen, and they disarmed this man Calloway because they thought maybe he was the killer because he had a gun. And so Tippit's gun, could have been swapped out for another gun too. And that's important because if he shot Kennedy from the grassy knoll, maybe they didn't want the actual gun to be anywhere near the evidence at that point. So just about all the evidence in the Tippit case is just full of errors and problems. And then the witnesses are a completely contradictory group. But there are some very interesting witnesses. Mrs. Aquila Clemens, for example, who was an African-American lady, a housekeeper working right down the block, heard the shots, went outside, saw 2 men, neither of whom looked like Oswald. And one was doing the shooting and one was with him, and they went off in different directions. And she very bravely told her story to several press people, and the police warned her she might get killed if she kept talking. She gave an interview on camera, which you can watch on YouTube, which is really terrific, that Emile D'Antonio and Mark Lane did this for their film Rush to Judgment in 1966, and then she's never been heard of again. I found the raw transcript of that interview, and I got some additional information on her. She was about 55 at the time, so she wouldn't be alive today, but, something bad might have happened to her. And there were other witnesses who, tried to tell the story. There was a man named Frank Wright who tried to tell the police that the shooter escaped in a car, and they didn't want to hear about him. So a couple of graduate students from Columbia came to the neighborhood a few months later and interviewed some of these people, and then the police belatedly went out and tried to interview them. And so there were witnesses who said things that didn't match the official story. There was a woman named Doris Holan who said another police car was in the alleyway. And one thing is interesting, if you look at the photos, Tippit pulled up and blocked an alleyway. And why did he do that? It could have been that he saw another police car there and thought something odd was going on and got out. And then somebody came out of the police car and shot him and ran back to the police car. And there was another man nearby behaving suspiciously. And another witness saw a police car there. And then Virginia Davis was the witness who lived in the house at the corner. She came running out of the house when she heard the shots, and she said there were policemen there at the scene. And no policeman officially showed up until 1:22, which is 13 minutes after Tippit was shot. So there was supposed to be only one policeman there, but she saw policemen. So I think that other policemen were involved in killing Tippit. And, it might have been to eliminate an assassin. Tippit and Oswald, the scapegoat, and maybe one of the shooters were supposed to have been killed that afternoon.
The whole thing is so unorganized in the Warren Commission. The more you look into it, the more you scratch your head and say, I'm not sure I believe any of this.
Yeah, and I've left out a couple of incidents. When Tippit was searching for Oswald in the last 24 minutes of his life, he was seen at a gas station overlooking the viaduct from downtown. You could get from Dealey Plaza to Oak Cliff in 90 seconds if you were driving fast. And he was stationed there in his car, and several people who knew him saw him, and then he took off at a high rate of speed. He was apparently looking for Oswald, and then he didn't see him. And Oswald, according to the Warren Commission, was on a bus, and then he took a cab. I think he was driven in a station wagon. Roger Craig, who was a very good sheriff's deputy, said he was driven away in a station wagon. But then Tippit takes off at a high rate of speed, and he's seen soon after that pulling over a guy driving on a car not too far from where Tippit ultimately was shot. A man named James Andrews said that Tippit pulled him over, and he was frantic, and he looked in the backseat of his car and then ran back into his car and took off again, like he was looking for somebody hiding in a car. And then he's seen at the Top 10 record store at about 1 o'clock by 2 people who knew him. the workers at the store, said he ran in and commandeered the telephone, and again was very agitated, and he dialed some number, apparently didn't get a reaction, although who knows, he might have heard something, but he hung up and ran out the door. So here's a guy acting very agitated, like he can't find the quarry that he's supposed to be looking for. And yet he turns up a few minutes later, allegedly driving very calmly down the street, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But something was happening that was very frantic. The other thing I should say, and I go into a lot of this in my book, Into the Nightmare, is that Tippit didn't leave a lot of footprints politically. He was not an obvious political man. His wife claimed he voted for Kennedy, but his mistress told me she didn't think he did. But his boss, Austin Cook, at the barbecue in Dallas, was a very interesting guy. He gave me a great interview. He was a member of the John Birch Society, far-right organization, and he said he thought Tippit was conservative, but not as conservative as I was, he said. But Austin Cook knew all kinds of people. Bill Alexander, the deputy DA, who was all over the case, was a friend of his. And he had connections with one of Jack Ruby's financial backer, Ralph Paul, was connected with Austin Cook. And through, there were all these right-wing groups in Dallas that were fomenting hatred against Kennedy, the Minutemen, the Ku Klux Klan, the John Birch Society, and some of them had attacked Adlai Stevenson not long before Kennedy came to town. And so here's Tippit in the middle of this nexus of all these people. He could have come to their attention because he worked at this drive-in where all these right-wingers hung out, and there were connections to Ruby, and then through Ruby to Oswald, et cetera. So Tippit could have been known to people in that milieu who might have offered him a job to be involved in this plot. And some people say, well, if he was not a very bright guy, why would they hire him? Well, he was a great shot, according to his father, for one thing, and he would do what they told him to do. And he had been in the military, and he was a terrific shot. So he moved in that milieu, that right-wing milieu, which is very suggestive.
There's something there. There's something, whether he was supposed to drive Lee to the Redbird Field or something, or pick him up or whatever. It seems to me that from the frantic activity, something had gone wrong and the plan had changed. So whatever the plan was, and with Lee leaving his wedding ring, maybe he thought, well, I'm being flown to Mexico City today, or I'm being flown to Cuba today. And, and I say that because after the identification at the police station, he kind of goes, now everyone will know who I am. Instead of being proud about something, as I was in an undercover operation, don't you get this? And now my whole cover's been blown.
He was an FBI informant, and I've got a wealth of evidence of that. And Henry Wade, the DA, told me that Oswald had been talking to the FBI a day or two before the assassination, which is something nobody knew. And he was probably passing along information about this plot against Kennedy, not realizing he was being set up. And a lot of people have speculated that maybe Tippit was hired to drive this guy out of town and didn't know who he was. And then he found out that he had supposedly shot the president and tried to arrest him and got shot. But I don't think that squares with the whole story of Tippit frantically running around Oak Cliff looking for this guy, because if he was supposed to help him escape, they would have had a rendezvous, and Tippit's behavior would not have been as frantic unless something terribly got wrong. But, we don't know the whole story of what Tippit might have been doing, but I put together everything we do know and a lot of fresh information that I've turned up from witnesses and documents, and with the help of other researchers. I mentioned Larry Ray Harris and Greg Lowry and Bill Pulte were very helpful, and Penn Jones. But, we're doing the job that the Warren Commission, the FBI, and the House Select Committee pretty much failed to do originally. And the Dallas police, they admitted to me that when Oswald was shot, they basically gave up their investigation. Henry Wade said, well, we were preparing the Ruby trial. We really didn't even have a file on Tippit. And that's kind of shameful, even if the officer is, the officer is dead, but the supposed suspect is dead. You don't just drop the case. You should investigate it. But they didn't really care enough to find out what happened. But I think that they didn't want to know. It was just too convenient to pin it on Oswald, and they didn't want to complicate the story with people saying, well, there are two men involved and neither one looked like Oswald, et cetera. And they could have found those witnesses like Aquila Clemens the Warren Commission denies that she existed even. And Lavelle admitted that somebody from their office had talked to her, but they didn't believe her, and he kind of scoffed at her, but she was a very credible witness. And there are other witnesses. Jack Tatum came forward years later and said that he had seen the killer fire a shot at Tippit while he was lying on the ground. It was what the House Select Committee called a coup de grace, a shot fired directly into his head. And they said this is typical of gangland executions. And they said, we don't know what this means, why this would be, a gangland execution kind of hit. And that got me thinking, and that was one of the triggers for my investigation was, if Tippit was executed like that, what had he done to deserve that, in the eyes of the perpetrators? Why would he be executed on the street like that? And what caused this? It wasn't just some random accidental shooting or something. He walked into a trap, an ambush.
I was going to ask you if you thought that Tippit had ever seen Oswald or known him before. There was some talk about an incident at a coffee shop.
Yeah. There were a lot of reports in the media and also to the FBI in the aftermath of the assassination that Ruby knew Oswald, Tippit knew Oswald, et cetera. None of these were ever proven. There was a story that Mark Lane put out about a meeting at the Carousel Club on November 14th where Oswald and Ruby were seen together, but that doesn't seem to hold up. And there was an incident at a diner near where Oswald lived 2 days before the assassination where Oswald supposedly was complaining about his food, and Tippit shot him a dirty look. And Greg Lowry thinks maybe Tippit was shadowing Oswald around Oak Cliff in preparation for November 22nd. I suppose that's possible, but we really don't know. But what's more significant, I think, than any incident that we can verify, because we can't, is that they moved in the same circles. They had a lot of interconnected friends and allies. And Jack Ruby seems to be, as Bill Pulte, the researcher, said, Ruby is everywhere in this case. It's interesting, when Ruby was testifying before the Warren Commission in the Dallas County Jail, he begged them to take him to Washington so he could tell the whole story. And Earl Warren said, well, we can't do that. What's that about? But he also said, I'm being blamed for being part of the assassination of our president. And Earl Warren said, well, I can assure you that none of the witnesses has ever said that. And Jack Ruby said, well, yes, but you don't know this area here. So Ruby was kind of signaling to the Warren Commission that if they asked him the right questions, he would talk about that he was more involved. He didn't just show up on Sunday and shoot Oswald, that he was more involved from day one than they knew, but they didn't want to hear about that either because that's too conspiratorial. Ruby, Tippit, Oswald were all part of the same milieu. They had a lot of powerful and also criminal friends who were all involved. I go a lot into the whole Dallas political structure, which was, as Peter Dale Scott, who studied this a lot, goes into, was a mixture of the underworld and the overworld. That it was a very corrupt police force, a corrupt city. The super rich oil men were very right wing, who knew a lot of the policemen. Jack Ruby knew a lot of the policemen. He was their bag man between the mob and the cops. And so I go into the connections of these big oil men with the assassination. And like the fellow who owned the Texas School Book Depository was an oil man named D.H. Byrd. And he was connected with a lot of people, involved in the case. And there were a lot of Army intelligence people involved. So there's this whole nexus of crime, police, and government people who were all mixed up with these three characters, Ruby, Oswald, and Tippit. And there are a lot of connections there. And we don't know, all the ins and outs of meetings that they might have had or whatever. But I draw together in an analytical way what I think was happening and give a pretty good picture of how the whole thing went down. I think I did my best. It's hard, a cold case after 50 years is hard to prove, and they've destroyed or neglected a lot of the evidence and the leads that they could have followed. But I had remarkable success getting people to talk and finding documents. And, it took a long time. It took more than 30 years to do this book, partly because it took that long to understand it and make it all clear in the book, and also to admit things that weren't clear. When you're trying to tell the truth about something, you have to say, well, I know this, but I'm not sure of this. And here are these two pieces of evidence that contradict each other, and I can't sort out the contradiction. I'm frank about that. And so I let the reader draw his or her own conclusions about some of these things. I do the best I can. But, the whole case has been left to private citizens, basically, because the government failed to do the job. The police department and the FBI and the Warren Commission failed to do the job for us.
Whatever their complicity may be, you mentioned D.H. Byrd. I heard a rumor that he'd actually had the window frame from where the shooter removed, and he had it set up in his home, kind of like a trophy.
Yeah, isn't that shocking? And he also, it turns out Russ Baker found out for his book, Family of Secrets, that the school book depository building, which had been called the Sexton building before that, and some of the police on the radio are still saying the shooting took place near the Sexton building. It was not a working warehouse until a few months before the assassination, and Russ thinks it was kind of a Potemkin village that was set up to look like a warehouse so they could steer this guy Oswald into a job there. So he's one of the suspicious characters, D.H. Byrd. The city government and the city police were complicit in this whole case, and so was Lyndon Johnson and the FBI and the Secret Service. And these are not pleasant facts to admit. And Dallas, the current Dallas, doesn't want to go into this. It would be healthy 50 years later if they could come clean. The city oligarchy, the same, old families, old money, and some of these people, they have a lot to protect in terms of, Dallas was held in great contempt and shame by a lot of Americans afterwards, and some people thought this was unfair. But, it wasn't an accident that this crime happened in Dallas. It was a perfect setup for the crime. They could control the law enforcement and the city government, and just killing Oswald in the basement of the police station is really astounding. That he was surrounded by about 60 policemen and handcuffed to Jim Lavelle and another detective, and he gets shot. People in Europe looked at that and said, this is so obvious.
Do you? Is it your conclusion that Lee Oswald was even there at that time between 107 and 109? Is that
no? I don't think he was there. Now, there were people who said they saw him, but, as I said, a lot of these identifications were tainted.
Take the John Armstrong point of view that they saw someone who looked like him, Yeah,
there was a double. Armstrong proved to my satisfaction there was an Oswald double, and he may have been running around Oak Cliff, somebody who looked like him. I don't think Oswald was there. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I don't think there's any evidence at all that he was a shooter. He could have been lured nearby so that people would think he was involved. That could have been a very sophisticated plot to have this guy there, but I don't think he was there. I think he was at the theater. But there is certainly no evidence of him pulling a trigger or anything like that. But there were other suspicious characters in the area. So I think Oswald was done a great injustice, and I do think there's plenty of evidence that he was working with the FBI. He thought to blow the whistle on this conspiracy, which had been, as we know now, in Chicago on November 2nd, there was a serious plot to kill Kennedy. It was thwarted by an FBI informant named Lee, who told them what was going to happen, and they managed to thwart that, and Kennedy, at the last minute, didn't fly to Chicago. Then there was talk about shooting him in Miami or Tampa beforehand, and according to some of the very credible people who were advance men, and a congressman said there were, and a Secret Serviceman, Abraham Bolden, said there were rumors flying all over that Kennedy was going to be shot, and it was just a question of where and when. They may have had different places where they could control the setting, but Texas proved to be the setting that worked.
The two incidents that come to my mind, and you mentioned one earlier, someone was seen arrested and escorted out the back alley of that, and then there's also a witness who saw someone looking like Lee Oswald sitting in a car at a gas station for some amount of time that it was suspicious enough he went over and took down the license number. And then when Oswald shot, they said, hey, that's the guy, And the same thing with the other witness who says, hey, that's the guy I saw arrested, but they took him out the back. I saw him. So what's this footage of him, being taken out the front door?
Well, the man who saw the guy being pulled out of the back, for one thing, the police report on the arrest said the suspect was captured in the balcony, which is different from Oswald was supposedly captured on the main floor. But somebody was taken out the back under arrest and driven away in a police car. And there was a man who ran a business nearby who said, I always thought I saw the gunman being taken out. And he was surprised to find out that the official story was the guy was arrested downstairs. And so there were mysterious, there may have been two Oswalds in the theater, but there was also this incident. It was at in the parking lot of a Mexican restaurant, which was near Oswald's rooming house and about a mile from the site of the Tippit shooting, where there was a man sitting in a car who looked a lot like Oswald. And there was a mechanic nearby who had been a sheriff's deputy, so he was a trained observer, and he actually took the trouble to write down the license number, and this guy took off in the car. And what turned out to be interesting was the license number. The FBI actually investigated this after Wes Wise, who later became mayor of Dallas, alerted them to this. He was a broadcaster. He heard about this incident. The car was registered to a man named Carl Mather, who turned out to be an old friend of the Tippit family. And he also worked for a company called Collins Radio, which he had a high security clearance. Collins Radio supplied a lot of the electronic communications equipment to the military, including the Vietnam War. They made a lot of money during the Vietnam War. And Mr. Mather had, one of his jobs had been working on Lyndon Johnson's airplane in Bethesda, Maryland, a very interesting, suspicious character. And they never really investigated him properly. The FBI kind of dismissed it because they claimed his car was a different color from the car they saw at the parking lot, which doesn't seem like very good grounds to dismiss a case.
And when somebody takes the license number down, I mean, they've got a number, not a color. Yeah,
they really should have investigated this guy. And Wes Wise had a dinner set up with Mr. Mather and his wife and a journalist from the East, and he said Mather was extremely nervous throughout the dinner. And then finally, the House Select Committee in the 70s wanted to interview him, and he insisted on immunity from prosecution, which is amazing. And they actually got the Attorney General, Griffin Bell, the head of the HSCA, got the Attorney General to agree to immunity for Mather, who basically claimed, as far as we know, that he didn't remember much about this incident. But why would they give this guy immunity? The only reason you would do that usually is either if it's some national security reason, or you're trying to get one person involved in the plot to squeal on the other person. But this fellow had all kinds of national security kinds of connections. And another odd thing was Lee Harvey Oswald was introduced to vice president of Collins Radio a few months before that by George de Mohrenschildt, his CIA handler. So that's one of those very interesting incidents that we don't know enough about to know what all that meant. Also, the Mathers turned up at the Tippit home that afternoon to go and comfort Mrs. Tippit. They were very close to the Tippits. Why would this guy with all these, big governmental connections be a close friend of an obscure Dallas policeman? That alone is a very interesting question. But I don't think we'll ever know because the investigation was not done properly at the time. All we can do is point to this as one of those very odd loose ends that is verifiable, but we don't know the whole story.
There was a car there. There was someone who looked enough like Lee Oswald that the guy thought that when he saw the next day him shot, and he said, that's the guy I saw in the car. And then he took that license plate number to Les Wise, and he believed him. And he was a reputable person. You said he was on the radio. Then he became mayor, I believe.
Bill Kelly, another good researcher, has suggested that maybe the Collins radio connection had something to do with communications, because Tippit was getting these off-the-record communications, and this other officer racing around Oak Cliff. There might have been some Collins radio connections there. And Roger Craig, a very honest deputy sheriff, was at the Texas School Book Depository at 1:06, and somebody said an officer just got shot. He looked at his watch, and how did they know that quickly? Because it didn't come over the police radio until 1:16. There must have been some kind of clandestine communications going on, and there were all kinds of stories about the White House Communications Center at the Sheraton Hotel had various kinds of radio connections. So, I mean, there are these loose ends. I put this stuff in the book. And I left out things that were not at all verifiable. There are a lot of rumors and things that I didn't put in the book, but I investigated things that we can actually find some hard evidence on, even if we don't know the whole story. And some people who disparage conspiracy theories make fun of the fact that we say there's a vast conspiracy, et cetera. You hear that phrase a lot, but actually, when I got into this case, you find all kinds of people who were involved on one level or another. Not all of them obviously knew about it ahead of time, but there are a lot of corrupt people out there who are willing to look the other way or to facilitate somebody's covering up of evidence, or, you know, police departments have a lot of corruption in them. Dallas was very corrupt. And so unfortunately, it leads to a lot of people who behaved in ways that were not truly patriotic. Some of them may have thought they were being patriotic because, you know, we want to preserve our system and make it look like it's a legitimate government that took over, you know, according to the Constitution, the vice president takes over, and that was the big theme of the media. Let's show that Johnson is legitimate. But in fact, you know, the conclusion is inescapable that he had to have known about it and been involved in some way, as did the military. And that's the kind of story the media are not equipped to handle, or certainly weren't in those days. So it falls to people like us, the alternate media. We're the people that have kept the story going. And I dedicate my book, though, to the witnesses, because I think those are the people that had the most guts and the most to lose. Some of them actually got killed. Some were, you know, threatened, terrified, et cetera. But they had a lot of guts, these people who came forward, and I dedicated to Aquila Clemens, S.M. Holland, and Marianne Moorman as examples of some of the bravest people. You know, we owe a lot. Those are the heroes of the case, in my opinion, of those witnesses. And that gives you some hope for America, that average people like that didn't want to cover up the fact that the president was killed, and they knew that the official story wasn't true, and they had to tell their story regardless of the cost. And then the second level of heroes, I think, are the reporters who go out there and knock on doors. But we're not as, and that gives you hope that the ordinary American is a pretty good person who wants the truth. And the corrupt people are in the media and you know, the government who want to preserve the system because that's what pays their bills. And they want to pretend that we live in this democracy. Unfortunately, I think our democracy ended on that day, and we live in what I call in the book a limited police state. And, you know, I wrote that a few months ago, and every day you find more evidence of that with these surveillance revelations that keep coming out. It's quite disturbing.
Yeah, I don't know how limited it is.
Maybe limited might have to be revised.
Let me ask you a little bit about, for people who don't know, why don't you just discuss S.M. Holland then, just because you mentioned you dedicated the book to him. And
if you see the movie Rush to Judgment, which I would highly recommend, Mark Lane wrote the book, and then he and the great documentary filmmaker Emile D'Antonio went out and made this film in Dallas, low-budget film, where they interviewed some of these witnesses. And S.M. Holland was the signal supervisor for the railroad. You know, right where Kennedy was passing through Dealey Plaza, there was a railroad overpass, and Holland was in charge of, you know, making sure the trains were coordinated. And so he was allowed to be up on the overpass with a bunch of railroad men and a couple policemen. And they said to him, you know, just tell us if everybody here is entitled to be here. They didn't want strangers up there because it's a violation of security to have unknown people up there. But he had a perfect vantage point. He saw the shooting, he saw the limousine, he saw Kennedy's body, and he saw smoke coming from the picket fence to the left on the grassy knoll, and he told the story on film. He's very impressive. He's like a Gary Cooper, like an old Gary Cooper kind of character, a real classic American Western truth-telling old guy who is extremely believable, and he is very angry that these lies were put out in the Warren Commission. He's quite scathing about it. And I found the uncut transcript in D'Antonio's papers in Wisconsin of Holland's interview, and he went into more detail on the kinds of weapons that he heard, because he was a guy who had been around guns his whole life. He was a hunter and all that, and he could tell the difference between different calibers of handguns and rifles. And he said there were two different kinds of guns being used on the grassy knoll. One was a rifle, one was a pistol, and he went into detail on the sounds. And there are other witnesses who talked about different sounds of the shots. So here's Holland. He didn't care, if somebody was going to shoot him, okay, he's going to tell the truth, But these people put their lives on the line to tell us the truth, and so we owe them a really incalculable debt. My feelings about Kennedy and what his death means to our country, and it's very personal, and it goes back, the whole book is very personal, and if people are looking for the book, it's only available on Amazon.com, by the way. It's not in bookstores. I did that on purpose. I did this as a very independent, self-published book because I wanted to tell exactly the truth, exactly the way I wanted to say it, and not pull any punches. Every important event that's happened in the last 53 years, the official stories don't make any sense. So,
okay, then, Joe, thanks for spending time, and until next time.
Thanks a lot. I look forward to the next time.
Good night.
Bye.